It's the
All
Big
right.
Fat American Podcast. I'm Zach Martin along with Kimberla, Lawson, Roby, and she's got this book. It's a best-selling book. It's about spirituality. It's called The Woman God Created You to Be. And the first question I would have, before we go any further, there's two. Tell us a little bit about yourself. I know if you go to the website, there's an About section, but tell us in your own words a little bit about yourself and what made you decide to write this book.
Okay, so I actually started my writing career a little differently from so many writer friends that I have, in that writing was not a lifelong dream of mine. So I did not aspire to do it, and as a matter of fact, I was 30 years old in 1995 before I sat down to write the very first book, which was entitled Behind Closed Doors, and wrote that book every evening, every weekend, every holiday. Fast forward 7 months later, it was complete. Went forward with trying to get it published, was rejected by every single literary agent, by every single publishing house, all of the editors that I submitted to, and was ready to give up. And long story short, my mom realized how serious I was about giving up, because I had then said, well, you know what, I have my bachelor's degree. I'm going to go ahead and apply to a couple of MBA programs. I was accepted to both of them, decided on one, and even went ahead and enrolled in the first class. And so she said, you know, I don't think you should give up. I don't know anything about publishing, but I do know that so many folks here in town that we've given copies of the manuscript to have said they enjoyed it, or that they couldn't put it down even, and she said, I think that means something. Finally, my husband said, you have this background in business, and why can't you just start your own company and publish the book yourself? And so that's what I did, and ended up doing well. I signed with a literary agent a few months later, and since then, including this first nonfiction book, I've written 28 books in total, and so my career turned out to be way more than I ever thought imaginable.
Now, if someone's listening, you see there's an idea. If you can't get it done, you got to do it yourself. So
Absolutely.
what Kimberla did is she founded her own publishing company and went for it. Now, your first book, from what I gather, was a fiction based on social issues, right?
Yes, it was, in fact. And I didn't necessarily plan that. I just knew that I had an interest in writing about couples in marriages and how folks can appear one way on the outside. Maybe they seem very, very happy, and even more so, especially now, kind of fast-forwarding today in social media days. But even back then, when I wrote that book in the 90s, people having maybe the nice house, the car, they have the great careers, and they look perfect on the outside. And my grandma used to say, even when I was a child, be careful of what you're wishing for or you see, because you never know what's going on behind closed doors. And so that's pretty much why I gave it that particular title. And so I show these two women who are best friends and how they appear to be perfect, but behind closed doors their lives are falling completely apart, and it shows how they stick together as best friends to sort of get their lives back into perspective. What I then heard from readers right away was that the reason they kept reading was because it was about real life issues, and they could either relate their own lives and problems to it, or they could relate it to the lives of family members or friends. And from there I thought, I'm just going to stick with that. And so all of my books, while they have been written in a fictional format, that first 27 books, they all center on real-life social issues and sometimes even very controversial topics and taboo topics as well.
We're talking with Kimberla Lawson, Roby. She's got her book, The Woman God Created Me to Be, and you touched upon something, how people might not match what they look on the outside with the inside. And I'll share a little bit of an example of this, and I really feel bad because I felt like maybe there was an opportunity where I should have said something. I was sitting across from Junior Seau, and we were having a discussion, and it seemed like something was bothering him. I didn't know what it was, and I left the conversation thinking to myself, maybe I should ask him how he's doing, or maybe I should, probe a little bit more to see if there's something there. And it turned out a couple weeks later, he killed himself, and he was suffering from CTE, a common thing that football players go through. And you look at Junior Seau, he's all NFL, a Hall of Famer, played in a couple Super Bowls, a very good-looking guy, and he's got a lot of athleticism and obviously the money that went with it, probably a nice life at home, but on the inside he was being tortured. And And I think that we should all pay a little bit more attention and go with that inner voice. That was my takeaway from that. I'll never let that happen again.
No, and I think we all have done that many times before. One of the things I talk about in the opening of the book, right in the introduction, is that most people had no idea, and on many days until I made it known, not even my husband, because I was very good about smiling even when there were moments when I knew that I was totally miserable on the inside. There were times when I took on speaking engagements with hundreds of people in the room, and I could deliver the speech and do what I was asked to do, and I could answer questions if, hopefully I'm able to help others, not knowing that really I was crying and just dying on the inside. And I have been blessed to have a wonderful career, 3 of the best publishers in the industry over these more than 2 decades. And I always say that I have the best readers in the whole wide world, and that's always been such a great blessing to me. But those last 7 books over those last 3 years of writing them, those fictional titles, I was completely miserable, and nobody even realized it.
So what was your secret of getting out of being miserable?
I was to the point where I felt as though I couldn't go on anymore. And so then I did start talking about it with my husband, and then I started sharing it with my brothers and my 2 best friends and just my daughter-in-law. And we were just saying, okay, I think everybody thought I just needed a break because I had been on this track of not just writing a book every single year, but I had gotten to the point for probably since 2008 writing 2 books per year, traveling on tours for both of them, and then usually working on another book in between that. And so they thought, you just probably need a break. But what I had come to realize was that I still loved writing. That's just a part of who I am. That's still my favorite thing to do. I just wasn't feeling this whole idea of writing fictional stories anymore. But at the same time, I really know and I believe with everything in me, I didn't just wake up one day and say, I'm supposed to write a nonfiction book, because that's not something I even wanted to do. I was afraid of the unknown and just kind of traveling down that particular road. But I know and believe that God really placed that on my heart and in my mind, and it just wouldn't go away as much as I wanted it to. And I finally made up my mind when I submitted my final book in my fictional contract with my publisher. I submitted that in December 2017 and took a break after that book came out in the summer of 2018 and started writing this book, my first nonfiction title, in the early part of 2019, and then also made the decision, like with my first title, the only title I had self-published was my first novel, I also self-published my first nonfiction book.
We're talking with Kimberla Lawson, Roby, the woman God created you to be, and you just started talking about that change you had in your heart. And a lot of people are listening right now. Got a captive audience. People are stuck inside because of COVID-19, and some people are despondent. Some people are maybe happy. Some people got it all together. Some people are exploring their options. For you, and this is a common question, how did you figure out what God was telling you to do? Take us through that process, because I think it'll help anybody that's listening. What does that sound like? What does it feel like?
So I think there is this idea of having in our minds what we want to do, what we maybe aspire to do. We may have dreamed of doing something, but then there's also God's voice. And to me, God's voice is that quiet, still voice that, first of all, won't go away, no matter how you try to move around it and ignore it and push it completely out of your mind and completely out of your heart, it just won't go away. And I am a big believer now that if you move to a place of just becoming quiet, you'll be able to distinguish. You have to be able to discern which is your voice and what you're just wanting to do, that whole kind of selfish ego side of us, as well as what it is he's wanting us to do. And a lot of times when he's wanting us to do something, if it is for the better good of someone and it is helping someone and serving someone, it's usually going to be something that's not all that comfortable for us. It usually means stepping outside of our boxes. But what I will tell you is that while I thought, how am I ever going to be able to write this nonfiction book? I hear you, God, and I want to be obedient, but how am I going to do something that I've never done? I've written novels all these years, but now on this side of it, what I share with everyone is that if you do what God has for you to do, He will give you every single tool that you need, because surprisingly for me, this ended up being my most enjoyable writing experience ever.
Oh, that's very cool. We're talking with Kimberla Lawson Roby. She's the author of The Woman God Created You to Be. She gave us some insight about how God talks to us. Now, the other thing I would also suggest to anybody listening is you can start small. It doesn't have to be a big thing. It can be little things. And loving thy neighbor and doing to the least, that's a good way to get started. And then you get on the path using your skills and talents that God has given you. Now, this book says The Woman God Created You to Be, but is it for only women?
No, it is not. And so, of course, my purpose in life, and I've known this, I knew this before I started writing the book, that my purpose, I have always believed and know to be, is to help women become all God created them to be. So that's where the title came from, and that's why my focus really has been on women, even with my speaking engagements as I have traveled around the country, so on and so forth. But now, going back, hearing from my own pastor saying, I only have one qualm with your book, he said just about a week ago, and that is that you didn't name it The Person God Created You to Be, because very much so could this have been a book that I would recommend even to men's ministries to read, because he's learning things himself. And so now I'm looking at that. And then one of my brothers read the entire book and called me, and he said, this book was just as much for me as it was for the women that you wrote it for. And I've learned some things that I didn't know, and I've even learned some things that I need to work on, I realize now. So it's been really wonderful to hear that.
Oh, yeah, you got to keep working on yourself. That's number one. Number two, I am looking forward to the day when I'm traveling, reading that book and getting the looks. That to me will be fun, right?
Exactly.
You share a part of the book, which is I think one of the best short stories ever told, by far. Do you know what I'm referring to? I think you do. The best short story ever told, in my opinion, is The Prodigal Son.
Oh, wow, yes.
What made you decide to write about that?
Because I've always thought that it was very interesting when you, first of all, grow up as siblings, and you can have two brothers and sisters, you can have two brothers, two sisters, you can have as many as 10 children in a family, and how they can all grow up very differently. They can all see their relationships with their parents very differently, and they can all turn out very differently as well. But I love the whole part about the prodigal son, that when that wayward son does go away, he does what he does, he loses everything, he has to sort of find his way back, doesn't know if he'll be welcomed back, but his father still forgives him and welcomes him back with open arms. And so it's that whole idea of forgiveness, and not only just thinking about the prodigal son, but thinking about God and how our relationships with him are on that same level, that we can't do anything terrible enough that God won't forgive us. We can't do anything that's so bad that he will stop loving us. And so I just love that whole prodigal son story for many different reasons.
And I would say a lot of people, when they focus on the story of the prodigal son, they can relate to the older son who is upset when the prodigal. But here's the problem with the older son. It goes back to another gospel story where the kid says, I'm not going to go out there and do it, and does it, while the other one says he's going to do it and doesn't do it. The people that do it anyway. So he is not thinking about his brother. He's not really thinking about his father, the older son. He's thinking about what he has and his possessions. And it's a bad location to have your heart. You're really not loving the father like you should. And then when his brother comes back, you'll notice he doesn't refer to him as his brother. And he'll go, that son of yours, or why did you throw him a party? And then in the Orthodox Church, after the Sunday of the Prodigal Son, when we do that gospel story, the whole week, if anybody ever paid attention, in the lectionary, it's all of these lessons about love from John. And it's to tell us that a heart of love is what's required, even towards your brother or towards your enemies or, towards your father. Don't focus on the material aspects like the older one did. Because I know a lot of people think about, it's kind of unfair. The older one, he's got a point there. But if you dig further, you discover something about yourself in the older one and something about yourself in the younger one. So it's a really good story. Now, you touch on forgiveness. It's a lot of, this could be a lot of problems for a lot of people because there are certain things that happen to other individuals in life that you would think are to the point where how could you possibly forgive? I could give some stories, but that's not what this is about. How do you treat forgiveness?
So for me, and it took me a while to get to this point, I talk about that in the book as well, in that in my earlier years, in my 20s and even as much as my early 30s, I was very good about being completely done with and holding grudges against people who have hurt me or harmed me in any way. And it didn't matter what level of harm. But if I experienced a certain amount of pain or deception or betrayal, the so-called stabbing in the back, I was through. There was no room for forgiveness. There wasn't any way you were going to be able to explain that to me or get me to see that you were sorry, even if you were. I mean, that's just who I was and how I handled that with a number of girlfriends, women over the years. And so now, of course, on this other side of it, I'm very different. I don't believe that if somebody harms you in a way where we might see it as unforgivable, or if that person might still be in a position of possibly harming you again, I don't believe you have to continue that same day-to-day relationship with them. I do, however, believe that as God wants us to, we have to forgive everyone regardless of what it is they have done. And even folks who have betrayed me in the past, to this day, I'm at a point in my life where if they really needed me for something, I would do whatever I could for them. But that is still usually, in some cases, not a person that I'm having phone conversations with or I get together with. If I see them, I speak to them, I can hug them, and all of that will be fine. But I do believe that if we expect God to forgive us for all of our sins and our shortcomings, which most of us will continue to have, and I'm sure we will have at least something until the day we die, then we certainly have to forgive others as well.
Well, it's part of the Our Father. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us.
Exactly.
It's not a suggestion.
No, it's not. It's not.
Now, I always suspected, and I could really I would appreciate your insight on this. It seems like with forgiveness, men and women are completely different with that for the most part. Because I just, what's your advice to the women listening right now about forgiveness?
And is it because, do you think men forgive more or women forgive more?
I think men are more forgetful.
That you think they are? Yeah, I do too. Because most men can say, well, you know what, okay, eventually you can just kind of move on. It's no bigger deal. But yeah, with women, we can hold on to certain things. And I think it's because we are much more of an emotional being than, say, men are, and I think that makes a big difference. We take things to heart, and we can keep things going and going and going, sometimes to the point where we don't even remember necessarily why we were so angry at someone, but yet we're still not speaking to them. And unfortunately, I have met women, elderly women, over the years, and I remember one specifically about 20 years ago who shared she and her siblings, and there were several of them, their parents passed away and there was property left, but it wasn't a full understanding of, the will didn't lay things out, I guess, exactly the way it should have. And so they each hired their own attorneys and they fought until the very end. And, it may sound cliche to say fought to the death, but they did, because many of them died not ever speaking to each other again. They went all those years. And so some people can really say, I'm just not forgiving you no matter what.
No, that's a detriment to the person who thinks that way. We're talking with Kimberla Lawson Roby. She is the author of The Woman God Created You to Be. It is a great book. I like this. It's good for spiritual direction. Before we tell people about your site, I'm going to throw you a curveball here. The best advice ever given to you by grandma.
Oh, wow. I was going to say, usually with my mom and my grandmother, it's so interchangeable with the two of them. It's like whatever my grandmother advised, and that's what my mom advised. But the one thing was this, and so I say my grandma, but for my mom, and I never stopped hearing it, and that is, no matter what, treat other people the way you want to be treated.
The golden rule. That's good.
Yes.
All right, so people can go to kimroby.com, which they can find out more information. Where else is the book being sold?
It is online at pretty much all retailers and bookstores, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Walmart, indiebook.org, which I'm always encouraging folks to buy from, because that way you can order from any of the small businesses that are independent bookstores nationwide.
That's good. And what about social media? How can people contact you?
Facebook.com/Kimberla Lawson Roby, Twitter.com/Kimberla L Roby, as well as Instagram.com Kimberla Lawson Roby.